Welcome. It's good to see all of you here. If you have a Bible, turn over to Luke chapter 6. We are this year going through the sayings of Jesus, and so we'll be focusing on a passage here in Luke chapter 6 this morning. Are you familiar with the term Ponzi scheme? Probably a lot of you are. Maybe some of you have been suckered by them. They're really old, but the name Ponzi scheme was attached to it from a guy named Charles Ponzi in 1920 who ran a very effective Ponzi scheme. The way a Ponzi scheme works is you take people's money, supposedly, ostensibly to invest, but all you do is keep the money, and then when people need money, you give them back money that you're getting from other people. Usually they promise ridiculous returns, like 10% per month or something like that. And so you don't ask for your money back because they tell you, oh, now you have this much. And you go, well, leave it in. And so it plays off people's greed to a degree, but it usually lasts for a while, and then it catches up to people because when you are promising and giving those kinds of returns, somebody's going to end up reporting you to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they're going to shut you down. But one of the most effective Ponzi schemes ever, and probably undoubtedly the largest one, was Bernie Madoff, who was finally arrested in 2008 after what the government accused him of, that they knew of, was about $65 billion that he took in, billion with a B, that he took in on his Ponzi scheme. Now, that number is probably a little unrealistic because some of what was credited to it was money that they made from his phony scheme. And so realistically, new money coming into Madoff was probably around $20 billion. Now, you might go, how could it last that long? It started in the early 80s, and he didn't go down until 2008. Some people say that he went clear back to 1970 or 71. So how in the world could he pull that off, what no one had ever done before, that magnitude and that duration? And there were several reasons why. First of all, Bernard Madoff wasn't promising ridiculous returns. He was promising 12 to 13%. Some years he said 9%. And so it didn't sound completely phony. But also, this guy's not some fly-by-night, guy that pops out of nowhere. Bernard Madoff was a very respected person in society. He was a smart guy. He helped start, and then he was the president of the National Association of Securities, investors. And so at one time, he was actually the chairman of the NASDAQ stock index. And so, he was an insider for sure. And he was a religious guy. He was Jewish. The religious charities loved him, invested in him. Yeshiva University entrusted their whole retirement to him. He had people like Sandy Koufax, the great Dodger pitcher, investing with him. Steven Spielberg invested millions of dollars with him. The major banks trusted him, Chase Manhattan, and they would, Morgan Stanley, they had lots of money, of his money that they were translating. So if you're looking at it, it doesn't look like a scam. And again, he's a good guy. He supported politicians. He did charitable work. When his son got lymphoma, he raised over $100 million for the Lymphoma Foundation. You look at it, he's very successful. You'd expect that. He's a brilliant guy. And so he had a flat in Manhattan, a big mansion in Florida, an estate in France, big yacht. Nothing that smacks of, here's a sneaky con man. He had been married over 50 years. His family worked with him. But here's the thing. Ultimately, when he finally was found out, he had no friends. In fact, his two sons that worked with him turned him in. And his wife of, at that time, 53 years, didn't even go to the trial. In fact, the judge gave him a 150-year sentence, which, it doesn't mean he'll serve the whole 150 years. He was 71 when he was convicted, but they did calculate it out that if he has really good behavior, he'll get out at the age of 201. But the judge said, the reason I'm giving you the maximum sentence is you don't even have one letter from anyone that says you're a good guy. Your family won't come here and appeal for you. Your wife, when the court talked to his wife, she said, I'm ashamed and embarrassed by what he has done. It's humiliating. She said, I feel like the man that I lived with for 53 years, I didn't even know him. And so a huge crash from this massively successful fraud. And how does that happen? I mean, how could people be so fooled, and then how can it go down so crazily? And here in Luke 6, Jesus says something that kind of pre-orders something like this. It kind of predicts that these are the kinds of things that can happen. First of all, let's look beginning with verse 43 of Luke chapter 6. Jesus said, "For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." Now Jesus starts talking about trees, and then in the middle of the little parable, he turns it into people. Now what he's saying is, eventually you will show your character. Eventually a tree is going to produce fruit or it doesn't. And so maybe you look at it and you're not sure what kind of tree it is, but if you wait long enough, it's going to come out. And he says people are that way. People will show their true colors eventually. And so he refers to out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And what he's talking about is you can speak in a way that's inconsistent with your character, but eventually it's going to pile up inside you. There's an abundance of this mess that's in there, and it will come out. You know how sometimes you're upset or something, and you say something really mean, and then you go, oh, what? You think, I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. I don't mean that. Yes, you do. As things pile up, when you say what you mean, you feel like, no, that's not consistent with the fraud that I've been perpetrating. That's not consistent with my ordinary hypocrisy, but that is precisely who we are when out of the abundance of the heart, things come out. And so what Jesus is saying is, ultimately, character will always reveal itself. Now, you can look at a plastic tree, and it looks like it's going to bear fruit, but it won't. And you can wish for your lemon tree to have oranges. It's not going to happen. What Jesus is saying is the truth ultimately comes out. Now, earlier in the chapter where he says, judge not that you be not judged, we looked at that, only we looked at it in Matthew. He's not saying be judgmental people. He's saying you don't have to, because who you are will always emerge. Your character will always be developed. Now, you look at that and go, well, so what? Where do you go with that? Well, Jesus continues. And this is really this is heart-wrenching, really, verse 46. He asks this question. He's puzzled. But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? Jesus isn't saying, I want you to do what I say. Come on, do it. He's just going, I know why you do what you do. You always do what you do because of what you believe. What I'm wondering is, why in the world are you pretending that I'm your Lord? Why do you tell me, oh, yes, I worship you, I follow you, you're everything, I'm a Christian, and you're not doing what I say? See, ultimately, and Kay Linskog said this years ago, she's a writer who has since gone to be with the Lord, but I heard her say one time, she said, you only believe, obviously, the parts of the Bible that you actually do. In other words, you want to know how much of the Bible you actually believe? Just see what you do. And if you really believe it, you'll do it. If you really believe what Jesus is saying, it will affect how you live your life. But now Jesus is talking to them and just going, I don't get this. Now, I understand why Bernie Madoff lived a fraudulent life, because he made a ton of money off of that life. And maybe there are some people who are making a lot of money off faking Christianity. I suppose there are. But for the most part, the disciples certainly weren't doing that. And so his question is sort of like, wait, what are you getting out of this? I mean, do you understand? I'm telling you stuff. You don't believe me. Obviously, you don't believe me because of what you do. Why? Why don't you just admit that you don't believe me? Why do you call me Lord? Why don't you just move on down the road rather than to be professing and creating this huge fraudulent religious experience that isn't real because you don't really believe what I'm saying? Now, if you look here in the context, where he is saying this and what he is saying, he's just given a bunch of real simple, basic instructions. For instance, in verse 27 here of Luke chapter 6, he says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you." So the one who died for you, the one that you say, I am a follower of him, he said, when somebody hates you, do good things for them. When they don't like you, that's your trigger to love them. And love, it would be hard if you said, love your enemies, if you mean by love, feeling a great sense of affection for them. But the Bible doesn't use love generally as a feeling. It almost exclusively uses it as a verb. This is something that you do. And then he makes it really clear. What you do is, as he says there, do good to those who hate you. So you listen to that. Jesus says that. What are you going to do with that? Is there going to be a time when you say, Jesus said it, and so I am going to have to do something good for someone who hates me? It's not easy, but it's fairly simple. It's something that you can do. I had this experience yesterday where I saw somebody who, at least to me, and he's expressed it to other people that he hates me, and I ran into him, and I was thinking of the scripture, and I just went up. I was very kind to him. Hey, let's get together. And he was kind of taken aback a little bit by it. But I thought, I'm doing this because that's what Jesus said to do. I don't know if it's going to make somebody not hate me, but it's a simple request. People who hate you, do good things for them. Now, what does it say about me if I don't do that? There's somebody who hates me, and I hate them back. There's somebody who hates me, and I wouldn't do a thing for them. It says that I don't believe what Jesus said, or that I don't respect him enough to do what he says. It's pretty basic, really. Now, you look down in the chapter, in verse 36. Therefore, be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. So show the kind of mercy that God shows. That's pretty simple. It's not a really complicated command. It's just give people a break. God lets you get away with stuff. Let other people get away with stuff. Be willing to just go, I'm going to show mercy here. Why? Because Jesus said to, and he's my Lord. Now, as you read on in verse 37, the same thing that we saw in Matthew, but he says it here, judge not, or don't be judgmental. And he gives some reasons why. Don't be condemning. So I have a choice. Do I look at other people and categorize them? Do I look at them in a judgmental way? Do I look at people and go, I know what they're about? Or do I listen to what Jesus says and go, I'm not going to jump to conclusions. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to give you an opportunity to do better next time. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to live that way. In verse 38, he says, give and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will he put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use to give, it'll be measured back to you. This is a real simple thing that Jesus says, and it's a command and a promise. He says, the degree to which you give to me is the degree to which I will give to you. I'll always pay you back for what you give. So it's a simple command to support the work of God. If you believe that he really will make it worth your while, that he really will give back to you to the degree that you give, it's easy to see whether you believe him or not. How much do you give? How generous are you? Now it's not a fundraising tactic for Jesus. It's a principle that's stated throughout the scriptures, but you can know. If you just look at how much you've given this year, you know whether or not you believe that. Is that how generous you want him to be with you? Just a clear command. Nothing fancy about it, but boy, does it expose the phoniness and the fraudish character that we can sometimes develop. And I mean, I've had people come into the church and they start making demands, and I'll just tell you right now, if you're going to tell somebody in the church that, now I financially support this church and so I want you to do this, I could just tell you, I'll have the accountant tell me how you financially support the church. So just don't go there. Because I've never had anyone who's generous to the church who ever tried to play that card anyway, because they were given as unto the Lord. But I've had people who had given anywhere from $0 to $15 in a year, trying to throw it out there as some sort of an intimidation. But listen, this is between you and God. You look at what you give, and you'll know whether or not you believe him, unless you just don't want him to give you anything, and that's hard to believe. He goes on. And look at verse 41. And we've gone over this before. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but don't perceive the plank in your own eye? Simple principle. Don't be looking at what's wrong with other people. Look for what's wrong with you. Expect that you will find bigger issues in your own life than what is substantially true in someone else's life. Do that. Do that self-examination and that honest reflection. And when you do that, then somebody may trust you and go, hey, there's just something in my eye. Can you take that out? Again, it's not really hard. It's just Jesus says to do it. If he's Lord, you'll do what he says. If he isn't Lord, why do you call him Lord? He seems confused almost. Jesus wasn't confused, but the way he's asking the question is, what in the world are you getting from this phony religious nonsense that you're doing, whereby it's obvious you really don't believe the truth? You don't believe that I'm telling the truth to you. Now, I want to make it really clear. We're not talking about being perfect. No one on this earth, other than Jesus, can be perfect for a week. Okay, that's impossible. But he isn't talking about the kind of righteousness that's just all pervasive. He's giving some simple little samples. And again, it's not a question of, oh man, I really want to be loving to people who hate me, but man, I messed up that time. But I'm going to work on it. That's all he's asking. Do you take it seriously? It's not that, I went through a time of my life when I just wasn't giving, and then I remembered what God had said, and I did it. I went through a time when I caught myself being judgmental, and I go, I don't want to be that person. That's all he's asking. And what he's asking for are very simple things. And it ends up being those simple things are the things that matter the most. Now he goes on. After asking that rhetorical question, kind of, what are you getting out of this fake life, being a Christian fraud? He then says in verse 47, whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I'll show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. He makes this parable, and he says, here is the distinction between two kinds of people. There are people who live lives of integrity, and there are people who live lives of fraud. Now, if someone builds a house for you, and it might look great, but if they didn't do the underground work, if they didn't do the foundational work, you were just defrauded. It's a lot harder to build a house correctly with integrity. And in construction, they actually have a term, structural integrity. It means that the house is constructed in a way that the weight of the roof and the walls is dispersed and goes down. There are certain load-bearing walls that transfer that weight into the foundation, which then transfers the weight into the earth, and it kind of radiates out from that. And that's called structural integrity. That house will hold up. Same thing with our lives. If we live lives of integrity, we will be able to stand against anything that occurs later. But if we live fraudulent lives, whereby what we do is develop a good facade, we learn the language, we kind of hang out with God's people, and we're ignoring the simple things that he says, we're asking eventually for the whole thing to collapse, because that's how it works. I had some great talks this week, knowing I was teaching on this passage. One of my sons, Danny, is an architect, and my other son, Will, is a civil engineer. And so I was talking to them, and they know way more than I do about construction, for sure. And I was talking to them about this. How important is the foundation, and how does that work? And here in this passage, the guy who was doing it right dug the foundation so that it went down to bedrock, so that it was anchored in bedrock. And my son Danny was reminding me about a thing we saw on TV. There was a house in Laguna that after having been washed away in a storm, this guy, and somebody talked to me after the service and told me who the guy is, some really rich guy, he decided to make a house that could withstand a tsunami. And so he went down into the bedrock, and actually underneath the house, these tons of beams went down like 20 stories, 200 feet, down into the ground. And then the house is constructed of steel and, special stormproof windows and everything, so that that house could get hit by a tsunami, and it's going to be standing if all the other houses are failing. And the reason is bedrock is something that you count on. Bedrock is not going to move. Now, we can't build every house like that. It would be too expensive. But it is important that we understand that if you build on sand, which is pretty much all of the area where we live, you have to do something to deal with how that's going to support things. Because sand is really strong. If you take sand, you can put as much weight on it as you want, and it's not going anywhere unless you get some water in it. Because when you get water in sand, what happens is, as my son explained it to me, water pressure per square inch is greater than the pressure of sand per square inch. So what happens is you put water in sand, the pressure of the water molecules push the sand away from each other, and sand is only strong if it's bound together. So you put water in sand, all of a sudden you have a bit of a problem. But in California, the greatest problem we have is that we also have seismic activity from time to time. And my son was explaining to me about liquefaction, which he said is the greatest danger that we have in this whole area of the country, of the world. Because liquefaction, where something just falls into the ground, happens because you have three things. You have sand, you have water, and you have seismic activity. And Will told me that in one of his engineering classes, they took a jar and filled it with sand. And you take a metal rod and try to pound it into the sand, and you can't do it. It's that strong. You put water in there, and it gets a little mushy. But if one guy shakes the jar while the other guy takes the pull, just goes right down in it. So that's why foundations are so important. Of course, today, what we do with building is that everything that we do is to keep the water away from the foundation, away from the building, so that you don't have that issue, the erosion and then the potential of liquefaction. So like here at the church, we have drains everywhere. We have a couple of places, pervious pavement, where the water goes down, it runs through a pipe, and it goes into a drain that's right out here because you have to protect it. But Will told me another interesting thing. The latest technology, when you're building on sand, is to build a decent foundation, but anchor it to bedrock. And so they run a hole down into the ground, deep into bedrock, and they cable this whole constructed building to the bedrock. And then if there's an earthquake or something, it just kind of wiggles back and forth. It shakes, but it doesn't fall apart. Now, it's amazing what Jesus knows about such things. But what he's saying is, how do you want your life to be? Would you like to fall apart the first time storms come? Do you want to just have no way that you can withstand the storm? Or would you like to live a life of integrity whereby your life can endure whatever it is that attacks it because it was built correctly? And I think most of us would go, yeah, certainly I want to have integrity. And so Jesus says, here's how you get integrity. Again, he says, whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, he's like the guy that does it right. Again, he's addressing fraudulent followers. And he's saying, all you have to do to build a foundation in your life that can result in a life that will withstand whatever it faces, all you need to do is simply listen to what I say. Now, if you have been going to church here for any length of time, you already got that down. Because every week we're listening to things that Jesus said, and you're hearing them today. But the other side of that factor is, hear what I say, and then do it. Do it. Now that is up to us. It's not that tough. It's not that complicated. How hard is it to just let go of the idea of judging people all the time? It's how hard it is to show mercy. It's just, do you believe that he's shown mercy to you? And if you understand that, that becomes easy. How hard is it to give when you know he's going to give it back? It just comes down to whether you trust him or not. How hard is it to just be nice to people or to follow the golden rule, treat people the way you like to be treated? Everything that he's saying here is little. Everything that he basically commanded as we've gone through the Gospels, it's mostly simple obedience to simple commandments. And most of them are in a place that it doesn't even show. If you start seeing a foundation, you're kind of in trouble. And so when you practice righteousness before men, Jesus says that's hypocrisy. But that's what makes this so tricky. Because nobody's really going to know whether or not you're judgmental. Eventually they'll figure out you're a judgmental person. But if you're working on that, they may not notice. If you're trying to give more, they may not see that. If you're somebody who's just trying to be kind, do nice things for people who hate you, that doesn't show. But see, that's what a foundation is. It's doing the things beneath the surface that will prepare you for the future. And it's these simple steps of obedience to him that matter. Now, some people build what they would call a foundation, but it's actually a bunker. If we want, we can spend all of our lives just digging underground. And so we go, my number one thing is to protect my kids so they're not leaving our property. And I'm afraid we aren't going to have enough food, so I'm going to stockpile tons of food. And I'm afraid that someday I may need it, so I'm going to stockpile ammo. And I'm going to build my life so locked tight, I don't have to have anything to do with the world at all. That's a bunker mentality. But we aren't here to make bunkers. I mean, it's stupid for us to be overly consumed with our safety when we die, we go to heaven. We're here to build a house. But to build that house with integrity, we need to focus on the foundation, obeying him in small and simple ways. And again, we're never going to be perfect at it. But what do you do with it when he tells you to do something? How are you obeying him or not? And Jesus would just go, why are you going to the trouble of faking it? Why are you going to the trouble of giving in a skimpy way, attending church, having bumper stickers, talking about how Jesus, Jesus? Remember, and believe me, this is deadly serious to me. And the reason is that I get up here and I talk to people about God and his word and Jesus every week. And I am haunted by the idea that in the last day, there will be people who say, oh, but Lord, didn't we? And he's going to say, I never knew you. So I trust him enough to take his word seriously. And that's why, you might think, I can't get over it. Maybe next week it'll be something funnier. But this is critical. Are you living the life of a fraud? And someday, when the storms come, it's going to become obvious that you're faking it. And you didn't even know you were faking it. You're just like doing what you do. That scares me. It really does. And we were looking at, on Wednesday nights, we're going through Philippians, and Jerry and I were looking in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul's talking to these great Christians, and he's saying, I'm afraid for you, that if you don't do this, I'm afraid that I just wasted all the ministry that I did for you. And that's the way I feel here. It's like, he seems so serious. And it seems like such a very real threat. And it's something that every one of us better look deep inside of ourselves, not to have deeper and deeper experiences with God. The foundation is not the deep and mystical things, the super spiritual things, or the great things that you do outside yourself. The foundation is private and personal, and it's between you and God, and it happens in a place where people usually won't even notice. But if you think about it, when he says something, the one who died for you says something, how seriously do you take it? Or do you just blow it off? I'm absolutely convinced that in our culture today, that people believe that if you take in enough information, that then somehow that makes you automatically grow. More information does not make you grow. If that worked, theologians would be great people, and they aren't. If it did, then pastors would be the best people in the world, and they aren't. No, this is much more basic than this. And it's not about how much you know or how much you hear. It's not about listening to 20 Bible studies a week. It might be about reading 3 words of what Jesus says and going, this week I'm going to try to do this. That's what foundation is. And here's the other thing. We've so glamorized the conversion experience that we do everything that we can do to move people to come forward. And Jesus would go, come forward? That does nothing. That's not foundational. It's about doing what I say. Are you willing to do what I say? And one reason why I don't make a big deal about trying to move people to come forward is because I think the last thing the church and the world needs is more fake Christians. I just don't think that's important. I would rather see people very simply doing the things that Jesus says, trusting him, believing him. Otherwise, how different is your faith than the faith of demons who believe that Jesus is God? They believe that he was born of a virgin. They believe he lived a perfect life. They believe he died his death for sinners. They believe he rose from the dead. They believe he's coming back. So if just knowing stuff would save you, the demons would be a lock. The problem is they have made a decision that has barred them forever from the presence of God and from being in fellowship with him. It is what you do. And at that time, it probably seemed like a very simple decision to rebel against God. But decisions have consequences. It's very important for us to understand this. Because I mean, on the one hand, it's really heavy and you're going, oh man, this is a bummer. I brought a non-Christian friend today and they're hearing this and this sounds so narrow-minded and bigoted and I don't intend that at all. But listen, if people are ever going to want to follow Jesus, it's only going to come when they see people who actually have integrity in their lives with Jesus. That's a powerful thing. Now, if you're here and you don't know Jesus, and you readily say, no, I don't believe it. A couple of things I want to say to you. First of all, good for you. I'm proud of you for being honest. The truth is, in your non-belief, you may have more integrity than a lot of people who think they're so holy, but are living a fraudulent life. So that's good. It's a place to start. But I just have a suggestion to make, just a wild idea. Why don't you test this and start either coming on Sundays or reading the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and when you find a little thing that Jesus says to do, try doing it. You don't have to believe in him. Just do what he says and see what happens. What I would predict would happen is you're going to find out, whoa, this really does change your life. And what you'll be doing is laying a foundation that could be an amazing life in the future. If you don't want to do that, you're like, nah, then that's okay. I respect that. I really do. I'm thankful that you're honest about that. But what are you going to do when the storm hits? What are you going to do when you go through something so horrible that you just don't know where to turn? I like the idea of laying a foundation for when that happens. So I'd encourage you to do that. But for those of us who say that we follow Jesus and call ourselves Christians, man, I just want to exhort you as strongly as I can. Listen to what he says and do those little things, please. And you may go, I don't know, I don't totally believe that it's going to work if I'm honest. Well, do it and see what happens. See if your life isn't better when you're obeying the simple commandments of Jesus under the surface where no one sees them. Experiment a little bit. But otherwise, I'm suggesting that you just admit you really don't believe in him. I mean, if you look at your life and you go, I am hateful to my enemies and I know it. I am judgmental and it's not changing. I am stingy with God. I'm robbing God, but I don't care. I'm judging other people. I'm looking at the speck in their eye more than I'm looking in my own. And that's the way it is. Then I'm just going to suggest that the next time somebody asks if you're a Christian, just say no. Because you aren't. There are not two tiers of Christianity. One where you punch your ticket to heaven and do whatever you want. And another where it's like you actually take him seriously and do what he says. Again, you're not going to be perfect. But do you believe him enough to at least try? Or is this what you're intending to do? Or are there areas of your life that you just flat out refuse? Jesus would go, why are you calling me Lord? And you don't take seriously what I say. You don't believe me. So, personally, I mean, if the result of this time that we spend together is that there are less fake Christians in the building and more people who admit that they're atheists, I'm good with that because I just want you to live integrity. I want you to, integrity means a whole thing. It's not a fraction. And it's like, I just want you to stop being a fraud because your fraud, your scam is going to run out eventually. And you're going to find out what you're really made of. So just own up to the truth. That's what Jesus would ask of all of us. Let's pray. God, I know this is a tough thing to hear, and we all love the light and airy stories and all in the Bible, and we don't like to be held accountable for what we actually do with what you tell us. But I believe from your word that this is literally life and death, heaven and hell. So I pray that each of us would be honest with ourselves. And if we really do believe you, and you really are Lord, that we would begin to focus on simple obedience in simple areas to build integrity and a foundation for our lives. And if we're at a place where we really don't trust you, and so we don't do what you say, help us to be honest and at least have integrity in admitting that you haven't yet convinced us that you should be Lord. And God, for people who are here who aren't sure, I pray that you just give them the common sense to just try it. There's nothing that you tell us to do that's weird or awful. It's just a little different response to life, to people. And if they're wondering whether you're real or not, I pray that they will test you by listening to what you say and doing it and seeing what happens. Please strengthen our foundations so that our building, our life, will be fruitful, protected against storms, and will bring glory to you. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.